Next slide. All right. So I want to start off today's presentation by saying that we want this presentation to be as interactive as possible, especially because Claire and I know that we do not hold all of the knowledge in this space, and that the best way to learn this is to not only learn from Claire and I, but also from each other and from our own experiences. So this training will provide you with foundational information and practical skills, and our objectives today are to describe the economic costs of sexual assault for survivors, understand the role social and institutional inequalities play in a survivor's financial security, understand financial abuse and the tactics that abusers use to impact survivors' financial security, develop strategies for discussing money with clients, and develop strategies for cultivating financial stability and safety for clients facing economic challenges. Next slide. So why does this training matter? Well, we live in a society where people often do not talk about money. And this can be problematic for survivors or their families if they don't know what options are out there or what financial assistance options they can have. If they're meeting with you and they're looking for support, but they don't know what options are out there, they may not think to ask you. And if it's not at the forefront of your mind, you may not think to bring it up in conversation. So we're going to be talking about the economic impact of sexual violence. We're going to talk about ways that you can talk to survivors about money. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Sexual Assault Legal Institute, and we'll wrap it up with questions. Next slide. The economic impact of sexual violence. So again, I want to provide a trigger warning. If this is a new topic to you, this may be triggering or may cause strong emotions. We encourage you to take breaks as needed. You will have access to this recording. You'll have access to the slides. So with that, we'll start off with this section. Next slide. All right. So for this poll question, I'm going to launch the poll in just a second. But I want to ask, how often is money a factor when you're working with survivors? And some examples to just get you started with thinking about this. This could be if a survivor cannot afford counseling, for example, or maybe they can't leave the abuser because the abuser maintains financial power and control over them. Maybe the survivor can't take off work for a court appointment, or they can't get to the hospital because they can't afford it. So those are some of the things to be thinking about. So I'm going to launch this poll. All right. So how often is money a factor for survivors you are working with? And I'll give you a minute or two. Can everyone see this poll? Okay, good. So I'll give you a few minutes to work on this poll. All right, so I'm going to close the poll in 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so it looks like 37% said every individual I work with has at least one financial barrier. 53% said most individuals I work with have a financial barrier. 7% says every so often money is a barrier, but not for everyone I work with. 0% said money is rarely a barrier. And 3% said, I don't know, money never comes up in conversation. All right. So money often may not come up in conversation. Typically, when a survivor is coming to you, the first thing that you might be thinking about is, are you physically safe? You know, like what's going on? What led up to this situation, as we talked about in the very first webinar. But financial situations, financial insecurities, money barriers, those are important things to also be considering when you're working with survivors. So I'm going to launch a second poll about whether or not, if money is not a factor, why might this be? Or if you're not experiencing, just a second, sorry, get this poll. There we go. So if money is not at the forefront of your mind, or if money is not something coming up in conversation, why might this be? So I'll give you a few minutes to work on this poll. All right, so I'll close the poll in 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so we have 0% of people said survivors in your community have all of the means to pay for their needs. 32% said all of the all of the services that a survivor may need are of no cost. 7% said money never comes up in conversation, and 61% said money is always a barrier. All right, so over the next couple of slides, we're going to talk a little bit more about why this is and how we can improve our services to meet the needs of the survivors. So in 2017, the CDC published a study called Lifetime Economic Burden of Rape Among U.S. Adults in the American Journal of Preventative Medicine. This study uses data from sexual violence research and the CDC's 2011 National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey to estimate the lifetime per victim and total population economic impact of rape among adult men and women in the US. The study found that someone who survives rape or an attempted rape is attempted to lose $122,461 over the course of their lifetime. And if someone survives child sexual abuse, they're likely to lose up to $282,000 over the course of their lifetime. Nationally, these economic costs include things like mental health care costs, negative impact on higher education, and childcare costs. And these costs total combine to $3.1 trillion over the course of the lifetime. So to break down this 3.1 trillion, this is 234 billion in criminal justice costs, 1.2 trillion in medical costs, and 1.6 trillion in lost productivity at work due to the sexual assault that victims experience. So these are costs that all of us pay. So it's not just the victim or survivor who's experiencing this that pays these individual costs, but as a whole society, from the lost productivity and from the loss of pay at work, we are all experiencing these losses when someone chooses to commit sexual violence. Next slide. So we're going to take a little deeper dive now into how some of these costs may show up in the lives of survivors. So work. Sexual harassment in the workplace can have a long-term effect on survivors, especially those who are in their prime earning years or laying the foundation for prime earning years. When survivors leave a job because of sexual harassment or sexual assault or possibly workplace retaliation, they may be leaving the job and going to a lower paying job because that's what's available. Or maybe they're leaving and they don't have a job lined up. Or maybe they're leaving from a full-time job and going to a part-time job, again, because that's what's available. Or they're overqualified for this other job, or they're taking a pay cut for this other job. So they're leaving one financial situation or one financial hardship and going to another one because of that sexual assault disrupting their work. If someone decides to stay despite the sexual harassment or sexual assault or workplace retaliation, they may be experiencing lost promotions or a loss of professional developmental opportunities, maybe lost productivity. We also have education. So this is skipping class or withdrawing from a course, dropping out of school or being forced out of school, incomplete college degrees, transferring schools. And it's important to note that if a survivor transfers a school because of a sexual assault, they don't have their student loan debt does not get canceled. So if they're in this one school and a sexual assault occurs, and now they transfer to this other school, now they have the student loan debt from this school and this school. So that's another important financial barrier to consider. And then negative impact on educational goals. Health. If mental health is impacted, it's also likely to impact a person's physical health. According to an Intimate Partner Violence and Sexual Assault and Stalking fact sheet from EVAWI, victims of intimate partner sexual violence are at a higher risk of experiencing health problems, including but not limited to pelvic pain, PTSD, chronic pain, and sexually transmitted infections. So these health consequences, they not only occur right after the assault, but also in the long term. We also have access. So this is things like childcare. high housing costs, costs associated with housing instability and homelessness, poor tenant history, and that could be due to the abuser maybe withholding rent payments or opening up payments in the victim's name and then not paying them. So that could ruin the victim's credit score. And there's also transportation costs. And then in this other category, we have debt, poor credit score, moving. That could be expensive if the survivor doesn't have the means to move. Property damage, if the abuser maybe damaged the property and now the victim is left with trying to figure out how to handle that or how to navigate that situation. And legal fees. Next slide. So this is a video that comes from a British online news source where survivors talk about their different experiences with how sexual assault impacted their career. So we're going to play this. I want to give another extra trigger warning that these are survivors talking about their lived experiences. So if you need to take a break, go ahead and do that. I also want to note that the volume is particularly low on this video, so we will turn up the volume as much as we can, but we encourage you to turn up your own computer volume, and we will also turn on closed captions.
It actually was hard to actually just get a job. It was hard to, go out there and sell. It actually was hard to actually just get a job. It was hard to, go out there and sell yourself and say, I'm a great, I'm a great hard worker, because people will be like, well, I haven't even been working for 2 years. And then, you can't actually say, well, that's because I was raped in 2008.
There was also about a 3-year period when I just felt absolutely exhausted. I found it very difficult to get out of bed. I found it very difficult to get on with my life. And I didn't want often to be out in the world.
So my career took a complete left turn, or right turn, I'm not sure. But my turn, let's start that over again. My career took a complete turn as a result of the rape. I mean, prior to that, I was actually a film producer, and I'd been working, pretty busy, active life for a small film production company, and it was exciting stuff. We were shortlisted for the Oscars. I went to the Oscars. The post-traumatic stress disorder, the anxiety, the depression. The complete lack of energy I had after the assaults totally robbed me of my ability to work as effectively. So I had to leave my job.
The amount of brain space that getting out of bed in the morning, getting clothes on,
it actually was hard to actually just get a job. It was hard to, go out there and sell yourself, and totally robbed me of my ability to work as effectively. So I had to leave my job.
The amount of brain space that getting out of bed in the morning, getting clothes on, doing the day-to-day of life suddenly became completely impossible.
It was actually years before I was able to work again. I wasn't able to go back to the previous job. I wasn't able to find a job afterwards.
I ended up quitting without having anywhere to go in terms of a job. And just, it was just very difficult to deal with those things at the same time. I was trying to phone various people, organisations like Women's Aid and Rape Crisis, sort of because I didn't want to do that at home, because I was still with my ex. I'd be doing that sort of like in meetings room, trying to be as quiet as possible. I'd be going to the toilets and crying and that kind of thing and trying to hide it.
I call that year my zombie year, because I was pretty much a zombie.
And of course this had an effect on my career. When once I'd been very energetic and very driven, I found it much harder to get the kind of energy that I needed to go forward and to make work.
It's not just that you're crying all the time. You're crying all the time because you don't have a career, and because you literally feel like you're devoid of your own personality as a result of the assault. And it affects the way you trust people in your relationships, and because your career is affected, it affects your finances, which can then have a massive impact, 5-10 years later, because you can't buy property.
At the moment, we're seeing a way of talking about mental health in the workplace where it's starting to become allowed to be able to talk about depression, but coming out and disclosing to your employer that you've been the victim of a sexual trauma is still full of taboo and stigma. stigmatized, and the number of women who have told me that they have lost their jobs as a result of disclosing it's just mind-boggling, and it's not right.
All right, so we can see that the survivors talked about some of the things that we've already discussed in the previous slides. Next slide. So not only does the cost of healing services and justice services rack up for survivors, but survivors may also be victims of financial or economic abuse. And this is where they have even less access to money or economic stability than the average person. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, financial or economic abuse occurs when an abuser controls their victim's access to shared or individual assets, conceals information from them, or limits their current or future earning potential. So this is one of the most powerful methods of keeping a survivor trapped in an abusive relationship, and it deeply diminishes the survivor's ability to stay safe after leaving the situation. Research indicates that financial abuse occurs in 99% of domestic violence cases. So this is pretty significant for those of you who are working with both domestic violence survivors and sexual assault survivors. Intimate partner sexual violence is common in domestic violence cases. According to the CDC's 2016-2017 National Report on Intimate Partner Violence, almost 1 in 2 women and more than 2 in 5 men reported experiencing sexual violence in their lifetime from an intimate partner. So that's 10.5% of them who reported rape, 13.7% who reported sexual coercion, and 8% who reported unwanted sexual contact. Financial or economic abuse can take many forms. Employment-related abuse is when the person causing harm prevents a victim from earning money. So some examples of this could be preventing the victim from attending a job, or sabotaging their work or employment opportunities by stalking or harassing them at the workplace. It could be forbidding them from attending a job training or advancement opportunities, or preventing the victim from looking for other jobs or attending job interviews. Coerced debt is when the person causing harm forces non-consensual credit-related transactions. So this could be like applying for credit cards or obtaining loans or opening accounts in the victim's name without the victim's knowledge. It could be forcing the victim to obtain loans or forcing them to sign financial documents. It could be using threats or physical force to convince victims to make credit-related transactions. It could be running up large amounts of debt on joint accounts or generating unauthorized debt. Withholding access to information and other needs may include preventing them from accessing financial information, records, or financial documents. It could also include not including the victim in investment or banking decisions. It could be refusing to pay or evading child support or manipulating the divorce process by drawing it out or hiding and not disclosing assets. Other forms of economic abuse may involve preventing a victim from accessing existing funds. So this could be like deciding when or how the victim can access or use cash or bank accounts or credit cards, or denying access to any of those. It could be demanding that the lease or mortgage or assets be in the abuser's name. It could be using the victim's checkbook or ATM card or credit cards without the victim's knowledge. It could be even withholding money or giving the victim an allowance. It could be forcing the victim to work in a family business without pay. So when all of this access is limited, a survivor may not have the tools to leave an unsafe situation, or they may be leaving one situation and going to another situation that may also be unsafe, or where they may not have access to housing or food or social support systems or healthcare or job insecurity. Next slide. So for this chat question, what are some examples of financial abuse that you have seen survivors experience? And when you put examples in the chat, please do not put any confidential information or identifying information. Just use like general examples. So what are some examples of financial abuse that you have seen survivors experience? So we have no access to bank accounts, abuser taking money from the victim for bills but not paying the bills, not allowing the survivor's name to be on the car or property, lack of transportation. Yep. Not allowing them to work, having bad credit, kicked out of the house, being forced to keep working and support the family, taking taxes. Yeah, these are really great. Buying a car under the victim's name and ruining the credit. Survivor's partner would provide money to the survivor for groceries and count the change in front of her with receipts to make sure it was all accounted for. And he would be abusive if he thought any money was missing. Remove the phone plan. Unable to hold a job. Yeah, these are all really great. All right, next slide. So as we wrap up this first portion of the training, we want to end on the very important topic of inequities that contribute to economic disparity for underserved populations. People who hold marginalized identities are at a higher risk of living in poverty. And people who live in poverty are at a higher risk of experiencing sexual violence. Underserved populations are already experiencing barriers to economic attainment without adding that extra layer of survivorship. For example, in terms of economic barriers, we have wage gaps. Wage gaps affect all women, but especially women of color due to intersectionality. Additionally, professions where more women are typically in them tend to experience lower paying jobs, for example, teachers. In a study conducted by the Human Rights Campaign analyzing wage disparities among LGBTQ+ employees, it was discovered that full-time LGBTQ+ employees earn 90 cents for every dollar that a full-time cisgender heterosexual employee makes. Other barriers include mass incarceration, gentrification, and redlining, all of which disproportionately affect people of color. There's also the school to prison pipeline, which disproportionately impacts people of color. Then we get into workplace sexual harassment or job discrimination among LGBTQ+ employees. According to a 2021 study by the UCLA School of Law Williams Institute, which documented experiences of workplace sexual harassment among members of LGBTQ+ communities, it was found that 45.5% of LGBTQ+ employees reported being terminated, not hired, or harassed due to their identity. LGBTQ+ youth also experience homelessness at higher rates, which is especially problematic considering homelessness is a risk factor for sexual violence. As well, environmental disasters such as toxic air and waste, or toxic water, environmental displacement of people, and natural disasters pose economic burdens that disproportionately impact people of color. So overall, people from underserved populations experience many barriers to economic security while simultaneously being more at risk of being victims of sexual violence. And each of these layers of violence and trauma and oppression intersect with economic insecurity. And so that's why this training is so important as we continue exploring new ways to serve survivors who are experiencing these injustices and stresses from so many places in their lives, including their financial situations. So this comes from the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, as a part of their intersectional approach to ending sexual violence. The quote says, "The economic burden for survivors of sexual assault is real. Women at the margins are the ones who bear the brunt of the harshest realities, including sexual violence. And they do so with the least resources. The most vulnerable communities facing poverty and economic hardship, as well as sexual violence, are dealing with the compounding and layering of burdens that impact basic needs, their ability to feed, clothe, and shelter themselves and their families. Services need to provide the comprehensive and flexible support that these survivors need." So this is something to be thinking about as we move into the next portion of today's training. I'm going to hand it off to you now, Claire.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. So the next part of our training, we're going to discuss starting the conversation about economic safety, advocacy, and independence. So before we explore the next steps within this conversation and different methods for navigating those steps, I wanted to acknowledge that, similar to many other aspects of our work, these conversations are certainly not one size fits all. In order to have a conversation that's worthwhile for our clients and truly provides supportive guidance and builds upon their strengths, we must acknowledge what sort of things may impact their current financial state and what they may be looking for from us. This includes recognizing that there are a wide range of circumstances, needs, goals, and acknowledging that because we perceive something as urgent does not mean that it is a priority for the survivor. So we need to consider their safety as an integral aspect to effective advocacy in all regards. And that aspect remains integral to ensuring effective economic advocacy as well. So we want to remember that each client may react differently to the conversation and may need something different from you as their advocate. So first, I just wanted to outline a few examples of what this conversation can look like for different scenarios with different survivors. So first we have client one, for example. They have no concerns about economic safety planning and do not wish to discuss any assistance relating to their financial state. They may find it insulting that we would initiate that conversation because they're completely comfortable financially and do not want or need our help in that area. For the second example, we have client two. Client two has experienced economic abuse. They've been forced to sign financial documents without understanding what they were, and their abusive partner has control of all of their earned wages from the last 2 years. They have shared assets, although the client is not sure if their name is included in anything, and they have children in common. They would not like to discuss criminal charges, but would like to discuss increasing economic safety, potentially through a protective order or family law options. And as the third example, we have client three. They have just physically left the home that they previously shared with an abusive party. They have poor or no credit and are trying to begin saving money but are unsure where to start. They would like to discuss options to assess their current financial state, increase financial safety, and discuss family law options that might be available to them. Their current employment options are limited due to their immigration status, and they're unsure how to navigate the risks after the abusive party previously threatened to use the client's immigration status against them. So I wanted to mention those examples to bring up the possibility of a wide range of circumstances that our clients may be experiencing. We want to be prepared to handle these and any other situations in an appropriate, client-focused, and trauma-informed way. And an important aspect of that is, even if we think we have the answer for a client, we need to remember that our job is to restore this person's agency over their own life and empower them to voice their needs and wants, and simply provide our knowledge and skills to assist them in reaching the goals and priorities that they've set for themselves. So the first step in this conversation is an initial screening. To begin the screening stage, you can start by collecting information. I wanted to highlight here that not all screening questions will look the same across different agencies. So before we talk about what some of those questions might be, it's important to consider as an advocate why you're asking these questions. And in assessing why you're asking these questions, think about how it's relevant to the work that you're doing, how you can use this information and work with this client to increase their safety and alleviate concerns, and where this conversation appropriately fits into your current process. Keep in mind, again, there are a lot of reasons why someone might feel uncomfortable talking about their finances. So it's important to put in the effort to make this conversation feel as natural and seamless as possible. Some suggestions for this stage of the conversation is structuring this conversation to center around the survivor. The goal is ultimately to have an understanding of their current financial situation, what their concerns are, what their priorities are in addressing those concerns, and anything else that they want us to know. It can be really difficult to not let our own perspective of what needs to be addressed here influence the questions that we ask. But just because something stands out to us does not mean that that's a priority for the client. So some examples of how to initiate this conversation are incorporating open-ended questions. These can allow for the client to choose what they want to share with us, making sure to center questions around the current impact of the situation and focus on clarifying their goals and priorities when discussing things further. And a few questions that I wanted to include were, how is your situation with money impacting your safety? What are your biggest worries regarding money? Do you have any concerns about your financial situation impacting your access to safe housing, stable income, or employment at the moment? Do you have any financial concerns about your credit, identity theft, or other matters? So once you've gotten through the initial screening conversation, the next step is time to go beyond those initial questions and continue that conversation. This is another stage where I think it's important to logistically assess where this conversation appropriately fits into your interactions with the client. Some things that I think are useful in assessing that are, does this need to be separate from the initial intake? Are there any urgent questions that you want to ask during that initial screening and explore further later on? And generally finding what makes the most sense in the context of your organization. The goal of this stage of the conversation is to build context. So we're aiming to build an understanding of where this client is coming from, what factors may impact their outlook, and what risks, strengths, and skills we should be considering, and what existing values the client may have pertaining to money. All of those things provide us with critical insight to the client's values when it comes to money and how those experiences may impact where they may feel comfortable or uncomfortable moving forward. These also give us an understanding of how people have helped and harmed this person, specifically pertaining to their finances, so that we can be mindful of that and build some protective factors, of course, if that's what the client wants, and just generally cultivate a more trusting dynamic within our agency. So some examples of questions at this stage are, what is important to you when it comes to money and why? Tell me more about your financial situation. What did you learn about money growing up, and how does that impact how you are with money now? When you have experienced financial hardship in the past, what have you done? And what worked, and what would you try again? What are your strengths when it comes to money? And who has hurt you in terms of your financial situation, and who has helped you? And how have those people done that? Again, this context allows us to address economic safety in a way that aligns with the client's values. It gives us a broader understanding of where this client is and how we can use those strengths, skills, and previous methods to kind of guide our safety planning and strategies. I think it's important here, just like most other aspects of our work, to kind of reflect on those initial screening questions and think about what was already asked and what information we have, and what would be helpful to know moving forward. I think that ensures that we're taking into consideration everything that the client has offered us so far before asking them to share more information on the sensitive subject. And I think it makes them feel heard in that conversation. All right. So before we move into more specific aspects of economic safety planning, I wanted to revisit the basic definition of safety planning for a moment. The important things to note about the definition of safety planning is that it's individualized, it's developed in partnership, and it addresses the unique needs and circumstances of individual survivors. As a reminder, we can't guarantee safety in any scenario, and often we're collaborating on these safety plans because a survivor is in an inherently unsafe environment. However, the ultimate goal of these conversations and plans are always safer. In economic safety planning, these goals and principles remain the same. We're just centering economic safety in that conversation. I would also like to mention, if your organization already has a process where you're collaborating on a more general overarching safety plan, this may fit nicely into that conversation, just as a more targeted facet of that general safety planning. Now, the goals of economic safety planning are pretty simple. We're working towards becoming economically safer and offering knowledge and tools to support a survivor's ability to work towards their own safety, prioritize the concerns and precautions most critical to them, and restore a survivor's sense of agency. For those goals to be achieved, an economic safety plan should address a wide range of safety needs of the survivor, work to reduce the survivor's economic risks based on their values, goals, priorities, and strengths, and focus on increasing a survivor's self-determination. So before we can create a safety plan with a client, we need to understand the general risks that they are experiencing or that apply to their situation. So we want to discuss what risks you can identify from the information you have so far and talk to the survivor about what feels accurate or inaccurate about your assessment of that information. That conversation should address things like risks associated with the abusive party. So those can be physical, psychological, sexual, economic, access to medical care or property or children, as well as general life risks. So experiencing things like isms or living in poverty, facing mental health challenges, aspects of employment, substance abuse, or education. And addressing with the survivor which of those risks feel most important and which of those risks feel most present in their situation. We also want to address fears and priorities that the client might have. So having a natural conversation about what scares them about this process after they've shared their fears, considering, can we alleviate that fear in any way while maintaining their safety? Is there anything that we are proposing or that we are planning to propose that might not be a safe option for this person? I think it's helpful to have conversation about fears and priorities because I think it takes a moment to acknowledge that we understand that approaching financial safety or just coming to terms with your current financial situation can be daunting and it's scary, and that's okay. and that we can work with those human emotions to try and incorporate, alleviating some of that fear into establishing safety. We also want to make sure that their priorities are clear. We can always confirm that what we understand still feels accurate to the survivor. And regardless of where we are in this process, whether that's checking in on how a safety plan that we previously developed is working, establishing, the initial safety plan, that can and should be an ongoing conversation, just to make sure that it's still applicable to them and it's still meeting their needs. So you also want to talk about the resources that are available to the survivor. Some of those are going to be economic, housing, community resources, but you also want to discuss what resources they have in themselves, meaning what skills do they have? How can these skills be used to increase safety? What are their strengths? How can we use those to build resources? And what have we ruled out? I also just wanted to provide some examples of community and personal skills and resources. Personal resources might be things like skills that might create opportunity, strengths that might help build resources, and any methods that they've used previously that have worked for them. Community resources can be things like storage, housing, general support, and partnerships. So before we move on to steps towards safety and security, I just wanted to include a reminder that even though these are steps to increase safety, they're not always safe. The safety of each option needs to be assessed on an individual basis. And during that conversation of risks and safety, that's when we should be kind of assessing whether or not these things are actually safe for this individual. And that should continue throughout the client's safety plan. It's important to know here, if the client does not feel like it's safe, then it's not safe. We can't make that determination for a survivor, and we need to be able to work within the safety of their own situation and adapt to their needs. All right. So we're going to discuss steps towards safety within a few different categories, but the first is surrounding bank accounts. So we should be creating individualized safety plans regarding financial safety and securities. And in addressing some of those things, one thing that may come up is bank accounts. So for bank accounts, this might mean closing joint bank accounts shared with an abusive party. It may mean securing existing bank accounts by changing passwords and PIN numbers, changing passwords on phones, computers, or other accounts, reviewing how to access accounts if they're locked out, and creating new bank accounts if needed. We also want to be sure to address safety as it relates to financial documents. So if possible, financial documents should be gathered and put in a safe place, but sometimes there are a few barriers to that. So if an abusive party is in possession of these documents, assess with the survivor whether or not it is safe to gather the documents or to make copies of those documents. If the client is able to collect those documents, make sure to collaborate on a safe location for them to be stored. And that's not only safe from the abusive party, but just generally a safe place for financial information to be stored. And if they don't know what that looks like, that's always information that you can offer to kind of give them the tools to find where that might be for them. And then also, if there are any missing documents, this can be a good place to offer tools and information on how to replace those missing documents. Another thing that is important to focus on is savings. So if access to financial resources is a concern, we want to start discussing potential ways that a client might be able to start saving money. So we want to talk through discussing what ways the survivor might be able to start saving, even the smallest amount, in a safe place. And then also navigate the risks and safety and revisit some of the concerns that the survivor may have mentioned in earlier discussions. These will obviously look different, especially depending on an abusive party's level of access to the client and other risks that might apply to their individual circumstances. But this can be a great place to kind of get creative with a survivor and to take advantage of some of the strengths and skills that you all discussed previously. And again, here, discuss a safe place to store savings, whether that is a bank, a friend, family member, another secure location, just finding, where feels secure for the survivor. And then also, if it applies to their situation, developing a plan if there is a risk that the savings might be discovered by an abusive party. All right. And then another crucial aspect of financial safety planning is addressing the survivor's cost of living and basic needs. So something that can be really helpful is creating a cost of living plan that the client can stick to and that helps them meet their basic needs. It is important here to create a plan that's realistic and meets the true needs of a client. Everyone's priorities and needs look different, and this is really only helpful if you're able to have an honest conversation with the survivor to ensure all of their needs are being considered. If they live with an abusive party, it can also be helpful to make two budgets, one for expenses living with the abusive party and one for living independently. And this is another place where it's really helpful to loop back to what resources this person might have access to and which resources they feel safe and comfortable using. So considering and providing information for community resources, which we'll talk a little bit about later on, that might be able to assist in meeting some of the client's needs without additional expense on the survivor. And then also considering safe relationships, whether that's friends, family, whoever, the survivor feels is a safe relationship that might be able to provide additional assistance or support. And especially talking to the survivor to see if that's something comfortable that they're comfortable with. If they're not, that's understandable. And we can always discuss how we can work with them to either make them feel comfortable or navigate, accessing those resources through different means. All right. And then lastly, it's also important to discuss any additional precautions that might be relevant to the client's situation. So you can explore options and determine the relevant additional steps kind of based on their individual needs. But some ideas of what these other precautions can look like is opening a credit line to use in emergencies, reviewing, assessing, and monitoring credit reports for suspicious activity, disputing coerced debt or unknown charges and accounts, disputing identity theft charges or accounts, though that one can require reporting to law enforcement or the IRS, which is, again, an important aspect of safety to discuss with survivors to see if that's something that feels right to them. And then also, these conversations may include the client wanting to speak to an attorney or another resource who can explore other potential remedies to economic safety or other concerns. Specific legal remedies that could potentially apply are things like protective orders, divorce, custody, criminal legal options, immigration legal options, and employment legal options. I will, of course, include Sally's information at the end of this presentation as well, But if your agency does not have attorneys in office, I think it's always helpful to consider fostering a relationship with other legal organizations in the community, whether that's Sally or another legal organization. It's helpful to have the opportunity for warm handoffs to kind of explore legal options if the client decides that they're interested in doing so. And if there's something that you can't come to a solution on, or, are having trouble brainstorming, creative ideas for how to address them or mitigate concerns, I always recommend collaborating with other advocates and attorneys and getting creative to see what you all can come up with. I know a lot of my work with survivors has improved, and I've become a better advocate as a result of collaborating with other advocates. And those can be advocates within your agency, it can be advocates within other agencies. But I think it's really helpful for, advocate minds to come together and see, what we can come up with for survivors. And it's always a great opportunity to be able to learn from other amazing advocates in your community. And then I also just wanted to note here, again, having an ongoing conversation with the client to make sure that they're feeling like their safety plan is still relevant, is always important. And make sure that it's working for them and that they don't need any additional support, making any alterations, or discussing how this may adapt with changes in their situation. All right, so next we're going to pose a few questions to everyone present, just to hopefully engage in some group discussion regarding economic advocacy. So for these questions, you are invited to either raise your hand through the selection at the bottom of your screen, to unmute and ask questions or answers. And then also, if you're more comfortable posting in the chat, you can always type responses and send them there as well. And I'll keep an eye on that as well. All right, so our first question for the group is, what methods have you used to begin the conversation surrounding a survivor's financial needs? And how have you used that to create a plan of action? And also, if you maybe don't have as much experience initiating that conversation and practicing that directly, I would also love to hear, if you have any thoughts about how you might begin that conversation in the future. Okay, a needs survey that clients are able to complete. That's great. And I think that can be really helpful. Stacy, is that something that takes place before an initial verbal intake with a client, or is that something that takes place afterwards? Always try to determine.
It's
Sorry, go ahead.
I just unmuted real quick. It was easier than typing it all.
Of
So
course.
whenever they come in and they're doing the intake at the CAC, so it's typically child abuse, sexual abuse, severe neglect, severe physical abuse, something like that. Whomever the caregiver is that comes in is given that to complete. And then from that point, not that I'm not here during that, but from that point, that allows me to start that conversation. Like, oh, I see you're behind in rent. Have you checked with our resource management team? Or, whatever that answer may be, have you checked with so-and-so, or how can we help? So that helps.
That's great. That's amazing. And I think it's really important to have that information up front to kind of be able to address those things in that conversation. And for some people, it may be easier to write down some of those concerns rather than sharing them in their first conversation with a new, advocate or just a new person in general. So I think that's great. Amazing. I always try to determine the needs of a client, and that normally encompasses financial needs to identify services. That's amazing. I think the survey idea makes sense, maybe with other types of questions, so it doesn't feel pointed. Absolutely. And I think, like Stacy and Mary both mentioned, kind of encompassing that in a general needs assessment is really important, because I think it stresses, hey, this is a really important aspect of, meeting your needs. But if someone isn't comfortable addressing that topic, it doesn't necessarily feel like they're, refusing to answer, or that it is more targeted. Begin with asking direct questions. How do you meet your financial needs, and in what ways will leaving this situation impact that ability? Absolutely. Comes up in the conversation about his or her concerns. We're asked directly if she has any concerns, if he or she has any concerns about the current financial situation. Absolutely. That's great. Amazing. Thank you all for your responses. And there are certainly a number of different methods that you can use to kind of initiate this conversation, and some may make more sense or make less sense depending on what type of organization you're working for and what scope of economic advocacy you're looking to engage in. Absolutely. All right, so our second question for the group is, what resources have you used or organizations have you referred a survivor to in Maryland that you or survivors have found helpful and effective? And same thing, feel free to raise your hand or come off mute, or send answers in the chat as well. And I'll also say it can be helpful to know if survivors have mentioned any resources specifically, even if you didn't refer them to them, that they found really helpful. I think that's really important to share as well. I always find that feedback to be incredibly valuable, to see, what survivors' firsthand experiences with different organizations are like. All right, so I'm seeing the Montgomery County Crisis Center, amazing, Catholic Charities, DSS, county resources for short-term financial help. Kathy, would you be comfortable sharing what county resources you typically refer to for short-term financial help? And House of Ruth, CCSI, Schbach Ministries Emergency Resource Center, Career Catches. Amazing. That's awesome. And I think, conversations like this are one of those methods of collaborating with other advocates to get creative in solutions that can be really, really valuable, because, none of us are ever going to know every resource out there. And, sometimes there are things that different organizations offer that we're unaware of. So exploring things like successful referrals or information that survivors have shared with other advocates, I think is always helpful in kind of making sure that we're effectively advocating for and referring survivors to trauma-informed and effective resources. Family Justice Center, amazing. Okay, so a list of resources in Calvert County that helps with utilities, groceries, that's amazing. Thank you so much for engaging with this question. So again, I think these responses and this discussion is something that is really important to ensuring that we as advocates are providing effective trauma-informed referrals when there's something that comes up that's outside of the scope of your organization's services. So, again, beyond this training, please also consider just engaging in this conversation with your colleagues and other advocates. We can always use one another as resources to learn and grow in our advocacy skills and resourcefulness. Now, in terms of resources, there are a number of resources, obviously, that we can use in collaborating on a plan of action with survivors. So in our next slide, I'll talk a little bit about another resource that you can engage with if there are aspects of your plan of action that fall outside of your scope of services. All right, so a wonderful source for community resources is Maryland 211. So whether you're offering their information to survivors or using it yourself, once you've discussed what resources might be helpful to the survivor, you can call or visit their website for access to an array of community organizations. Those may include organizations that you're already aware of, but sometimes it can be helpful if there's maybe a need that's not being met that you're not entirely sure who may be able to address that. And this can also just help establish a more well-rounded community support network, especially for survivors who are seeking things like victim services, legal services, resources for folks experiencing homelessness, shelters and housing assistance, departments of human services, mental health providers, campus health providers, and substance use treatment centers and recovery programs. And I think it's important to know too is sometimes I forget that it's not just us knowing them, but it's also them knowing us and knowing that, you know, if a survivor is seeking services through their organization, they have a connection to advocacy or legal services or something like that, if that's something that the client is looking for and mentions in their conversation with them. Now, obviously, there are a myriad of potential financial legal remedies depending on the facts of the situation. But I did just want to include Sally's information and a little bit of information about what Sally does and what Sally legal advocates do. Sally advocates, such as myself, can help with things like financial safety planning, and attorneys can offer things like legal consultations that will help identify any legal remedies that might be relevant for a survivor. So I just wanted to go through a few quick examples of what those things might be. The first is criminal legal advocacy, so advocating for the rights of crime victims. And those can be things relating to health, safety, like setting release conditions, privacy, like shielding personal information, financial. There is the Criminal Injuries Compensation Board. There are also civil legal services for survivors, so things like peace and protective orders, privacy issues, things like non-consensual sharing of intimate images, housing issues, including termination of lease, employment law matters, primary and secondary school issues, and Title IX proceedings, so things like administrative hearings and school sex discrimination and sexual harassment policies, immigration legal services, including things like file with self petitions, U visas, and T visas. And then, of course, family law, including divorce and custody. And then we also provide referrals for tort cases and, of course, discuss safety planning with survivors as well. So that is Sally's main phone line. That's our confidential phone line. And I will also have my contact information towards the end of this presentation as well. And on that note, I will pass it off to Alyssa.
Thank you.
Of course.
Sorry, just realized I was muted. One of our Sally staff attorneys hosted a Money Matters Lunch and Learn series in 2023. So these are the 4 videos in that series. We highly recommend watching them. They're about 30 minutes each, and they go into these different legal remedies and support options for working with survivors to improve their financial situations and provide that economic empowerment. So I just posted in the chat a link to our online training library. If you go through that and access the financial support options tab, you'll be able to see all 4 of these videos listed there. You can also access these 4 videos on MCASA's YouTube channel. If you click on the Money Matters playlist, you'll see all 4 videos. And with that, we'll go on to the next slide. So this is our contact information. Thank you again for coming, and I will post the evaluation link in the chat right now. All right. So thank you again for coming. We highly encourage you to check out those Money Matters videos. We greatly appreciate all feedback on our evaluation form. If you're seeking a certificate of attendance or a certificate for CEU credits, you must complete the evaluation form. Upon submitting the evaluation, you'll see a box at the top of your webpage containing a link. And if you click on that link, you'll be able to access the certificate request form. If you have any questions, we'll stick around for a couple of more minutes. Feel free to come off mute, or you can put stuff in the chat. Thank you again for coming, and we hope to see you tomorrow for the final presentation in this training series.